They say you have until sundown. The elder's voice cut through the falling snow, flat and final. And if you're still inside the town limits after that, we will not be responsible for what happens to you. And the preacher's daughter stood there with her hands folded at her waist, knuckles white beneath her gloves, eyes fixed on the narrow road vanishing into the storm as if it were already calling her name. "I didn't do what they said," she whispered at last, her voice thin but steady. And the way she said it unsettled the crowd because it didn't sound like begging. It sounded like truth, spoken after the town had already decided it was inconvenient. Someone laughed under their breath. "That's what they all say." Another voice followed, sharper. "Your father should have taught you better." And at that she turned, breath shaking now, and said, "He did. That's why he's dead." The words landing wrong and heavy, a sudden weight even the snow seemed to hesitate beneath. A woman crossed herself, a man muttered blasphemy, and the elder cleared his throat as if to scrape the moment away. "Enough. Gather your things. The road is open." She took one step forward, then stopped, the cold already biting through her boots. "Where am I supposed to go?" she asked, and no one answered. Not the men who had sung hymns beside her father, not the women who once pressed her hand during prayer, not the locked church doors behind her where grief still lingered like smoke. The snow thickened as she turned away, clutching the small bundle they had allowed her to keep, each step off the boardwalk feeling less like walking and more like erasure. The wind snapping her skirt against her legs as if urging her to hurry and disappear. The fields beyond town were already swallowing fences, the white stretching endless and empty, and panic pulled tight in her chest as the last buildings faded, because exile was not just being sent away, it was being made invisible. She walked anyway, breath bursting bright in the cold, pride carrying her farther than warmth ever could, until the road bent beneath leaning cottonwoods, and her strength finally faltered, knees buckling as she caught herself on a fence post, chest heaving, eyes burning from wind and unshed tears. That was when a low voice carried through the snow behind her, calm and certain. "She won't make it far in this weather." And she turned, expecting another deputy, another order to hurry and vanish, but instead saw a lone cowboy on a dark horse, hat brim low, snow dusting his shoulders, watching her not like a judge and not like a savior either, but like a man who had noticed something that didn't fit the story the town had chosen. The elder's words echoed faintly from the distance, the town already closing ranks behind its decision, and the girl felt the terrible pull between the road ahead and the stranger's steady gaze, unsure which was more dangerous, hope or the cold, as the cowboy added quietly. "You send her out like this, you ought to be honest about what you're really doing." And in the hush of the falling snow, his refusal to look away marked the first crack in a lie that had already taken a life and was now trying to take another. For a long moment, no one spoke, the snow filling the silence with its soft insistence, and then the elder's voice tightened, stripped of its patience. "This is church business," he said, stepping forward as if authority itself might warm him against the cold. "And it's already been decided." The cowboy didn't raise his voice when he answered, but it carried anyway, steady and unyielding. "Decided by who?" A murmur rippled through the crowd, uneasy now, and the preacher's daughter felt her heart hammer as eyes shifted between the two men, the air suddenly heavy with something that felt like consequence. "By this town," the elder snapped. "By its elders, by its faith." The cowboy tipped his head slightly, gaze never leaving the girl. "Faith don't need lies to stand," he said, and someone sucked in a breath sharp enough to cut. The girl's fingers tightened around her bundle, fear and something dangerously close to relief tangling in her chest as she whispered, "Sir, please, don't," because hope had always come with a price she couldn't afford. He glanced at her then, just once, his voice lowering. "I won't speak for you," he said, "but I won't pretend I don't see what's happening either." The elder's face flushed. "She walks out now," he ordered, gesturing toward the road, "or we escort her ourselves." The words landed like a shove, and before the girl could stop herself she took a step back, boots slipping in the slush, the town closing in with its judgment sharpened by impatience. The cowboy swung down from his horse in one smooth motion, boots planting firm in the snow between her and the crowd, not blocking her path, but standing close enough that she could feel the warmth of another body against the cold. "You're sending her to die," he said quietly, and the simplicity of it struck harder than accusation. Mind your tongue, the elder hissed. Mind yours, the cowboy replied, eyes lifting at last to meet him. Because if she doesn't make it past the bend, every man standing here will know exactly what name to give this. The girl's breath came fast now, the world narrowing to the space between the stranger and the people who had raised her, and she realized with a jolt that the road ahead was no longer empty. Someone was willing to walk it with her, even if only far enough to expose the truth the town refused to carry. The elder's mouth tightened as if he might argue further, but the cold seemed to steal the appetite for spectacle from the crowd, and one by one they stepped back, boots crunching into slush, leaving the girl and the cowboy standing alone at the edge of town with the road opening white and unforgiving before them. You don't have to, she said quietly, once the murmurs faded, the words slipping out with more honesty than strength, because she had learned early that men who stepped in often stepped away just as quickly when the cost became clear. The cowboy studied her face as if weighing not her worth, but the truth of the moment, then shook his head once. I know, he said, but I'm going anyway. And with that he turned his horse and fell into step beside her, matching his pace to hers so precisely it felt less like escort and more like company. Snow thickened as they moved beyond the last fence line, the town shrinking behind them until it became a smear of dark shapes against the white, and the girl felt her fear sharpen with each step, not of the cold alone, but of what would happen when the warmth of another presence faded and she was left to face the night with only her own breath for proof of life. She tried to keep her stride even, pride stiffening her spine when her toes went numb, but it was the cowboy who noticed first when her steps shortened, when the bundle in her arms began to tremble with the effort of holding on. There's a place ahead, he said, nodding toward a low shape half buried in drifts. Old church, been closed years, we can wait out the worst of it. She hesitated, the word church scraping against raw memory, but the wind cut sharper then, and she nodded, allowing herself the small mercy of shelter without calling it rescue. Inside, the air was stale but still. The snow muffled to a distant hiss against the walls, and the cowboy set about building a fire, with the quiet efficiency of someone used to working without praise. She sat on a pew with her hands folded tight, watching the flame take, warmth blooming painfully slow into her fingers, and when she finally spoke again, it was to say, They won't forgive you for this, because it felt important he know the shape of what he'd chosen. He glanced back at her, firelight catching the edge of his jaw. They already decided what they think of me, he said, almost gently. Doesn't change much. The simplicity of the answer unsettled her more than any promise could have, because it carried no illusion of safety, only a steady acceptance of consequence. As the storm pressed harder against the windows and the fire settled into a low, breathing rhythm, she realized that for the first time since her father's death, someone was not asking her to disappear quietly or explain herself loudly, but was simply staying. And in that small, dangerous grace, the night loosened its grip just enough for her to believe she might survive it. The fire burned low and steady as night deepened around the abandoned church, the wind pressing against the walls in long, restless sighs that made the old boards creak like they were remembering prayers no one spoke anymore. And the preacher's daughter sat with her hands wrapped around a tin cup the cowboy had filled with warmed water, the heat stinging her fingers back to life in small, painful waves. For a long time, neither of them spoke, the quiet heavy but not accusing, until she finally broke it in a voice so soft it almost seemed meant for the fire alone. They said I shamed him, she murmured, eyes fixed on the flames, that I brought sin into his house, and the way she said it carried less anger than disbelief, as if she still could not understand how a lie had found so many willing mouths. She told him how a man from town had come calling after evening service, how he had spoken gently at first and then not at all, how she had pushed him away and run, and how by morning the story had twisted into something unrecognizable, a version where her refusal became invitation and her fear became guilt. Her father had believed her without hesitation, she said, had stood before the elders and demanded they look her in the eye when they accused her, and when they would not, he had raised his voice for the first time in his life, a small rebellion that cost him everything. He said the truth doesn't need numbers, she whispered, tears finally slipping free. Just someone brave enough to stand alone with it. and the cowboy felt something hard settle in his chest as he listened, the shape of a familiar injustice wearing a different face. He did not interrupt, did not offer comfort that might cheapen what she had carried, only shifted closer to the fire to block the draft that kept finding her shoulders, a quiet act of protection that said more than words. When she finished, the silence that followed felt altered, not empty, but full of what had been spoken at last, and she lifted her gaze to him with a question she did not voice but did not need to. "They chose the easier story," he said finally, his voice low and certain. "And once folks do that, they'll defend it harder than the truth." And as the fire popped softly between them, she realized he was not telling her what should have happened, but naming what had, a simple honesty that steadied her breathing in a way nothing else had all day. Morning crept into the church in thin, pale strips of light, the storm having worn itself out sometime before dawn, and the preacher's daughter woke stiff and aching but alive, the fire reduced to a bed of red coals that still held warmth when the cowboy stirred them back to life. She felt embarrassed for sleeping so deeply in the presence of a stranger, yet there had been something in the way he kept his distance, in the way he moved quietly so as not to startle her, that let her body rest even when her mind stayed half alert. Outside, the snow lay thick and unbroken, the world scrubbed clean in a way that felt almost mocking, and as she stepped out into the cold air, her breath caught at the beauty of it, because it looked like a beginning, even though she knew beginnings were rarely that simple. They shared a small breakfast from what he carried in his saddlebag, eaten slowly with gloved hands, and she found herself watching him when she thought he wasn't looking, noticing how he listened more than he spoke, how he never hurried her words when she gathered the courage to say them. She told him she could not go back to town, not now, not ever, and when she said it, she waited for the disappointment or the insistence she had learned to expect, but he only nodded as if she had named a fact rather than made a request. "There's a cabin a ways north," he said, tracing a rough line in the snow with his boot, "empty since last spring. It's not much, but it's standing." And the way he offered it, without promise, without condition, made her chest tighten with a gratitude she wasn't sure how to carry yet. As they started walking again, the weight of the past day settled into something quieter, still heavy but no longer crushing, and she realized with a start that she was no longer counting steps to endure the road, but simply moving forward, matching his pace, letting the sound of their boots in the snow replace the echo of the town's judgment. And for the first time since her father's voice had fallen silent, she felt the faint, dangerous pull of a future that did not require her to disappear in order to survive. They had not gone far when the sense of being watched returned, subtle at first, like a shift in the air rather than a sound, and the preacher's daughter felt it before she understood it, a tightening in her chest that made her steps falter as she glanced back over her shoulder at the long stretch of road they had already crossed. The cowboy noticed at once, not because she spoke, but because her rhythm changed, and he slowed, eyes lifting to the ridgeline where dark shapes now broke the clean sweep of snow. 3 riders crested the rise and stopped, their horses steaming in the cold, silhouettes too deliberate to be coincidence, and even from a distance she recognized the posture of men who believed the road belonged to them. "They followed," she said quietly, the words tasting bitter, and he nodded as if he had expected no less, guiding her off the road toward a stand of trees where the wind cut softer. The riders descended at an easy pace, confident, the kind of confidence that came from knowing a town would back them no matter what they did, and when they drew close enough their voices carried sharp and accusing, calling her name like a summons rather than a greeting. "You can stop running now," one of them shouted. "The elders want this handled proper." She felt her hands shake, fear rising fast and hot because she knew what proper meant in a place that had already decided her guilt, and she turned to the cowboy with an apology forming on her lips, ready to tell him to leave before their trouble became his sentence. He didn't let her finish. He stepped forward just enough to put himself in their line of sight. His voice calm, but edged with something that made the riders hesitate. "You've said your piece," he told them. "She's not going back with you." A laugh followed, brittle and mean. "You don't get to decide that," another man sneered. "She belongs to the town." The word struck her harder than any insult had, and she straightened despite the fear clawing at her throat, because something in the way the cowboy stood, unmoving, unafraid, made it impossible to shrink. "I don't belong to anyone," she said, surprising even herself with the steadiness of it, and the men stared at her as if a thing they had dismissed had suddenly spoken. The snow whispered around them. The moment stretched thin and dangerous, and the cowboy's hand drifted closer to his coat, not threatening, but ready, as he added quietly, "You want to keep this clean?" You turn back now. And for the first time since leaving town, she understood that whatever came next would not be decided by rumor or silence, but by the courage to stand in the open and refuse to be claimed by a lie. The men did not answer right away, and in that pause, the cold seemed to sharpen, the silence stretching until it felt like a held breath that could break either way, and the preacher's daughter became acutely aware of how exposed they were. The trees thin, the road close enough that anyone passing would see only shapes and decide later who was right. One of the riders finally dismounted, boots sinking into the snow as he spread his hands in a mockery of calm. "We're not here to hurt anyone," he said, the lie practiced and smooth. "We're here to bring her back so things can be settled the right way." The cowboy didn't move. "They were settled," he replied. "You just didn't like the truth," and the man's mouth tightened, as if the word itself offended him. Another rider leaned forward in his saddle, eyes fixed on her. "You walk back with us now," he said, "and maybe we convince the elders to be merciful." And the way he said merciful made her stomach turn, because she knew mercy that came with conditions was only another kind of control. She looked at the cowboy then, not for permission, but for reassurance, that standing her ground would not undo everything he had already risked, and when he met her gaze there was no hesitation there, only a quiet certainty that steadied her spine. "I won't go," she said, louder this time, the words clear in the cold air, and for a heartbeat she felt the fear loosen its grip simply because she had named her choice out loud. The man who stood nearest laughed sharply. "You hear that?" he called back to the others. "She thinks she gets to choose," and the sound scraped against her nerves, but she did not look away. The cowboy took one slow step forward, not aggressive, just present, and said, "She does." And something in his tone made the riders glance at one another, recalculating, because defiance spoken without shouting carried a weight they had not expected. The wind shifted, blowing snow across their boots, and in that moment she realized this confrontation was not about dragging her back anymore, but about whether the town's version of power would be allowed to follow her wherever she went. She drew a breath deep enough to steady her shaking hands and said, "If you want me, you'll have to tell everyone why." And the challenge hung there, fragile and dangerous, forcing the men to decide whether they were brave enough to drag a lie into the open where it could be seen for what it was. The challenge unsettled them more than any threat could have, and the men shifted in their saddles, eyes flicking toward the road as if suddenly aware of how exposed they were with nothing but their certainty to hide behind. One of them muttered that this wasn't how it was supposed to go, that they'd been told she would fold once pressed, and the admission slipped out before he could stop it, hanging in the cold air like a crack in ice. The preacher's daughter felt a strange calm settle over her then, not because the danger had passed, but because the lie finally had edges she could see, and she squared her shoulders, refusing to step back into the shape they had made for her. "You don't get to decide what happens to me anymore," she said, voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. And the words felt heavier and truer than anything she had spoken in town. The cowboy stood beside her, close enough that she could feel the heat of him through their coats, his presence not looming but solid. And when one of the riders reached down as if to grab her arm, he lifted his hand just enough to stop the motion without touching anyone. "This ends here," he said quietly, and something in his calm carried the promise of consequences without naming them. The men hesitated, weighing pride against exposure, and finally the one who seemed least certain spat into the snow and shook his head. "This ain't worth it," he said under his breath, and though the others bristled, none of them argued hard enough to make it stick. One by one they turned their horses, the decision made not in honor, but in fear of being forced to explain themselves later, and as they rode back toward town, the sound of hooves faded into the white, leaving the road empty again. The preacher's daughter released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her knees threatening to give as the adrenaline drained away, and she pressed her hand briefly to her chest, grounding herself in the simple fact that she was still standing. The cowboy glanced at her, a question in his eyes that asked without words if she was all right, and when she nodded, he allowed himself the smallest exhale. Together they turned north again, the snow crunching beneath their boots, and though the danger had not vanished entirely, she knew something irreversible had shifted. The lie had followed her out of town, but it had not survived the light. The truth did not arrive with shouting or triumph, but with the slow collapse of certainty, and the preacher's daughter felt it first in the way the men avoided her eyes when they rode back into town, their confidence leaking away with every step they took toward the elder's table. The cowboy stayed beside her, not touching her, not guiding her, simply present in a way that made it impossible for the room to pretend she was not there. And when the elder demanded explanations, the story they brought back sounded smaller than it had on the road, full of gaps they could not close. She listened as they spoke around her rather than to her, careful words chosen to protect themselves, until the man who had first accused her shifted under the weight of too many glances and finally broke. His voice cracking as he tried to defend what no longer stood upright. He claimed misunderstanding, then concern, then faith, each excuse thinner than the last, until the room went still and the lie had nowhere left to hide. The elder's face hardened, not with repentance but with recognition, and he asked the question that should have been asked at the beginning, the one no one could answer now without shame. "Is there proof?" Silence answered him, heavy and complete. The preacher's daughter spoke then, her voice steady despite the tightness in her chest, and she told them exactly what had happened, not dressed in righteousness or anger, only in truth, naming the moment she had said no, the door she had closed, the fear she had carried alone while the story twisted behind her back. No one interrupted her this time. When she finished, the elder lowered his eyes, and the man who had started it all stepped back as if distance could erase what he had done. The decision came quietly, almost begrudgingly. Her name would be cleared, the accusation withdrawn, the town's judgment reversed in words, if not in spirit. The cowboy said nothing as it happened, but when the elder looked at him and muttered something about interference, he met the gaze without apology. "You needed the truth," he said simply. "I brought her where she could speak it." Outside, the cold air felt different, sharper but cleaner, and as they stepped away from the building that had once condemned her, the preacher's daughter realized justice had not returned what she lost, but it had taken away the lie that tried to define her, and for the first time that felt like enough to let her move forward. They did not return to the town once the truth had been spoken, and the preacher's daughter felt no pull to look back as she walked away, only a strange lightness where the weight of judgment had once pressed, because justice, once named, did not need an audience to remain true. The cowboy led her north again, past the last familiar fence lines and into the quieter stretch of land where snow lay untouched and the world seemed willing to forget what it had been told. The cabin waited where he said it would, small and weathered but standing firm against the cold, and when he pushed the door open and stepped aside to let her enter first, the gesture felt deliberate, a recognition rather than an invitation. Inside, the fire took quickly, warmth spreading in slow, honest waves, and she moved through the space with careful steps, touching the table, the window frame, the rough wood of the wall, grounding herself in the reality that this place asked nothing of her except presence. She thanked him then, not with the kind of gratitude that bends into debt, but with the steady clarity of someone who had been seen and protected without being claimed, and he nodded once, accepting it without ceremony. "You decide what comes next," he said, voice low. "Not the town, not me." And the words settled deep, carrying more weight than any promise. As the days passed, the snow softened and the silence of the cabin became companionable rather than empty, filled with small, purposeful acts, splitting wood, mending a loose hinge, sharing meals eaten slowly in the fading light. She began to speak more freely, her voice still cautious but no longer afraid. And when she talked about her father, it was with sorrow rather than shame, his name no longer something that needed defending. The cowboy listened the same way he always had, without interruption, without judgment, and in that listening, she found a kind of peace that did not depend on forgiveness from others. One evening, as the sky cleared and stars cut sharp through the cold, she stood outside the cabin and breathed deeply, the air filling her lungs without resistance, and she realized that exile had not ended her life, but redirected it, away from a place that demanded her silence and toward one that respected her voice. The cowboy joined her at the door, not stepping too close, and together they watched the night settle, two figures framed by lamplight and snow, not bound by rescue or obligation, but by a shared understanding that sometimes redemption is not about returning home, but about choosing where you will stand once the lie no longer follows you. This was another true-hearted story from Redemption West. If this touched you, subscribe for more frontier tales of mercy and courage.